I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speakers tonight, although they need no introduction, kind of like David Letterman says. Gary Gallagher received his BA from Adams State College of Colorado and his MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. He began his academic career in 1986 at Penn State University, where he taught for 12 years. In 1998, he joined the faculty of the University of Virginia and held the John L. Now III Professorship in the History of the American Civil War and served as the founding director of the Now Center for Civil War History. He is the author or editor of more than 50 books, some of which we auctioned off tonight, and has participated in more than 6 television projects in the field. He's been active in the field of historic preservation, and he was president in 1987 to mid-1994 of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which is the forerunner of the Civil War Trust, which is now known as the American Battlefield Trust. So he was at the forefront of starting that organization. Professor Emerita Joan Waugh of the UCLA History Department researches, writes, and teaches about 19th century America, specializing in the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age era. Dr. Waugh has published numerous essays and books on Civil War and Reconstruction topics, single-authored, co-authored, and edited, including the prize-winning U.S. grant, American Hero, American Myth, in 2009, for sale tonight. Together with Gary Gallagher, in 2015, she co-authored The American War, A History of the Civil War Era, now in its 3rd edition. She was president of the Society of Civil War Historians from 2020 to 2023. Dr. Waugh has been interviewed for many documentaries on Ulysses S. Grant, and she is also a director on the U.S. Grant Advisory Board. Both of our speakers are recipients of distinguished teaching awards from their respective universities and have served as visiting fellows at the Huntington Library. Many of you will have attended their conferences that were held at the Huntington Library and appreciated them bringing that Civil War history and those vaunted speakers to the West Coast for our enjoyment. Together, they are responsible for convening those conferences and attended by many of our members. And so we want you to welcome tonight our distinguished speakers as they share their insights on Lincoln and his general.
It's a little bit of a difficult task tonight. We're going to talk about Lincoln and his generals' leadership during the Great American Crisis. And we're talking to a group of people who already know a lot about Abraham Lincoln, his life and his career and his place in United States history, which means that giving a program like this is a little bit daunting. The odds against our presenting anything about Abraham Lincoln that is absolutely new, that no one's ever heard about, is 0. That is not going to happen. What we've decided to do tonight is to pursue another strategy. We're going to offer what we think is a useful way for ordinary Americans, perhaps not knowing a great deal about the Civil War era or any part of U.S. history, which is to say almost all people who live in the United States, a way for them to think about Abraham Lincoln and his leadership, especially as that leadership is illuminated by his relationship with key military commanders. Our focus is going to be on Lincoln and 4 of his generals, his most important ones: Winfield Scott, George B. McClellan, Joseph Hooker, and U.S. Grant. All but Hooker, as you know, served as General-in-Chief of the United States Armies, which was the highest position you could hold in U.S. military forces in the 19th century. And Hooker, the 4th, commanded the Republic's preeminent field army for a critical period in 1863. We take as our baseline that no other U.S. president has faced a set of challenges comparable to those that Lincoln faced, including George Washington, who shepherded the young republic through its first fraught decade, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was in the White House during both the Great Depression and World War II. Our presentation is in 3 parts, and there's the man right there looking at you from a photograph taken in 1863. The first part consists of framing observations that convey the scale and complexity of the task that confronted Lincoln and the structure of the government within which he functioned. The second focuses on Lincoln's style of leadership as Commander-in-Chief, and we'll finish with analysis of Lincoln's relationship with those 4 generals, and we'll use each one of those generals to illustrate key elements of his presidential leadership. So we'll start with these framing observations, and the first of those is that the scale of the Civil War was unprecedented. Any evaluation of Abraham Lincoln's leadership must begin with an appreciation of the magnitude of the war that engulfed the nation about 6 weeks after he took the oath of office on March 4th, 1861. Of all military conflicts in U.S. history, the Civil War directly touched by far the highest percentage of the population. A few statistics are instructive. More than 3 million citizens took up arms during the Civil War, which would translate to more than 35 million under arms today in the United States of 2025. 4 years of fighting produced between 620,000 and 750,000 military deaths. Scholars disagree about those numbers. They disagree about everything. I think 750,000 is too high, but we know that 620,000 is the absolute lowest number. That's more than all other U.S. wars combined, and the equivalent of between 6.5 and 8 million dead in the United States of 2025. We'll never know the number of civilians who died either directly or indirectly because of the war, but we do know that between 550,000 and 750,000 black and white Americans became refugees during the war. That number, again, that would be 8 million refugees now. And 4 million enslaved African Americans, about 12.5% of the entire population, were freed. The war also extracted a staggering fiscal cost. The United States government's budget in 1860, the last year before the war, was $63 million. By 1865, it had mushroomed to $1.3 billion. And if you add the Confederate expenses in that same year, it surpasses $2 billion. That means that 1860's annual expenditures would have paid for about 11 days of the government's activities in 1865. In the long term, the cost of the war would mushroom, especially in the form of pensions for United States veterans that composed more than a quarter of the United States budget for every year between 1880 and 1910. As late as 2016, at least one Union soldier's widow was still receiving the Civil War pension from the United States government.
Our second framing observation is that waging a war in a democratic republic posed special challenges to Lincoln. Lincoln had to balance demands from a welter of political constituencies to keep the war going. Most obviously, he had to maintain support for the war among both Republicans and Democrats, and the latter constituted about 45% of the electorate. During the first 2 years of the war, he often had to keep in mind the 4 slave-holding border states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, that had not seceded. Border state interests and those of the Democratic Party in general seldom aligned well with the anti-slavery wing of the Republican Party, complicating Lincoln's handling of policy regarding emancipation and many other issues. Lincoln's cabinet included both Republicans and Democrats, and a number of prominent political figures were commissioned generals and given charge of the armies to satisfy various interests. Among the latter group, John Charles Fremont and Nathaniel Prentice Banks stood among the most prominent. Fremont had been a U.S. Senator from our state of California in the 1850s and the Republican candidate for president in 1856. Banks from Massachusetts had been the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the mid-1850s. These two, together with other political generals, compiled a record of, wait for it, almost unbroken failure. We have no equivalent of them today. Imagine turning on your newscast some evening, or your podcast, and hearing a report that General Nancy Pelosi or General Ted Cruz had been deployed to lead the U.S. forces in response to a crisis. Under the Constitution, the civilian government was supreme, with military leaders always subordinate to political leaders. Some generals understood this and some did not. Friction in this regard led to difficult times between Lincoln and some of his generals, as we shall see. Lincoln understood that maintaining civilian morale in the United States would be the most important factor in forging a winning war effort. If events on the battlefield or political controversies on the home front, and the two were often linked, convinced enough citizens of the United States that the war was not worth the human and material cost, the Confederacy would win despite having fewer soldiers and resources. The United States' experience in Vietnam offers us a clear lesson about how wars end, in democratic republics, regardless of the military reality on the ground, when voters decide to withhold their support.
Our third framing observation is that technology forced Lincoln to adapt to conditions previously unknown in managing a war. He oversaw a conflict in which telegraphic communications and railroads shrank time and space dramatically. Now, neither of these technological innovations was new. There's not a single technological innovation that's actually new in the Civil War. There's no new technology that made any big difference. But the degree to which these played central roles in the conflict far surpassed what had come earlier in the Crimean War. Lincoln quickly grasped the centrality of railroads in both operational and logistical dimensions of the conflict. A number of campaigns, as you all know, were designed to disrupt Confederate communications and the transfer of supplies from one part of the Confederacy to another. Key rail centers that became targets included Nashville and Chattanooga in Tennessee, Corinth in Mississippi, two major roads crossed in Corinth, Atlanta, Georgia, and Petersburg, Virginia. The boundary of the state of West Virginia, which joined the Union in 1863, was drawn to make certain that the vital Baltimore and Ohio Railroad did not dip below, did not dip into Virginia below the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. If the people in a couple of key counties had been allowed to vote, they certainly would have voted against going into the new state of West Virginia. But because the B&O Railroad did, that part of Virginia became part of the new state of West Virginia. The telegraph loomed even larger as a consequential factor for Lincoln. This technological phenomenon was immensely important. It's the equivalent now to the many ways in which our methods of communication have been advanced over the past few decades. The telegraph provided almost instant communication with generals in the field and allowed Lincoln to intervene more directly in what was going on in the military fronts than had been the case with any previous president. He often spent time in a telegraph office built near the White House, literally looking over the shoulders of young soldiers who translated from Morse code the texts of incoming dispatches. Lincoln called those dispatches lightning messages. He sometimes slept on a cot in the telegraph office when great battles were in progress. You all know that scene in Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln that has Lincoln in the telegraph office. He argues with Stanton in this scene, but he's talking back and forth with the young telegraphers who work there. That scene is actually quite accurate in terms of how Lincoln actually behaved. During his first year as president, he sent an average of 1 telegram per month to his generals. By the middle of 1862, he often sent flurries of messages in a single day. The telegraph office also served as a place of refuge for him, where the stream of visitors seeking favors could not intrude. "I came here to escape my persecutors," he said once to the young soldiers of the U.S. Military Telegraph Corps in the office. And one telegrapher observed he would there relax from the strain and care ever present in the White House. And while waiting for fresh dispatches or while they were being deciphered, he would make running comments or tell his inimitable stories.
Our fourth and final framing observation is how the size and power of the presidency shaped what Lincoln could and could not do as commander-in-chief. The United States bureaucracy was tiny, imagine that, and the presidency in no way resembled today's imperial edifice. The federal civilian workforce numbered just 5,381 in 1861, in a population of roughly 31,500,000. By way of comparison, today's United States, with a population 11 times as large, employs 2.1 million civilian federal workers, roughly 390 times the number in 1861. The only regular contact most Americans of Lincoln's day had with the federal government was when they sent or received mail. Not a single agency provided the type of services Americans now take for granted. Abraham Lincoln's personal staff, one that oversaw the day-to-day operations in the White House, consisted of just 3 principal secretaries, all men, and in case you're wondering, that would be John Hay, John Nicolai, and William Stoddard. Lincoln had no press office, no political chief of staff, no cluster of talented speechwriters to craft his statements. There was no secret service to protect the president. Office seekers or others who sought an audience with Lincoln could simply just show up at the White House and wait in line for the chance to see him, which perhaps accounts for his frequent presence in the telegraph office as a place of refuge. Great wars proved voracious in terms of money and manpower, and in these vital areas, Congress, not Abraham Lincoln, held the power and took the lead. To help bear the cost of the war, Congress enacted the first graduated income tax, printed $500 million worth of paper money that for the first time in U.S. history served as legal tender, and created a national banking system. To fill the armies, Congress passed the first National Conscription Act in U.S. history, implemented in the spring of 1863, and profoundly controversial. Lincoln supported all these measures and more as necessary expansions of federal authority to sustain a massive military effort. Lincoln pushed the limits of his own authority on many occasions and did not shrink from taking unpopular actions. For example, he suspended the constitutionally protected right of habeas corpus to deal with the pro-Confederate activity in parts of Maryland in 1861. He also agreed that some Democratic newspapers should be shut down for voicing opinions that could weaken the war effort. Many Democrats attacked him as a tyrant who trampled on basic constitutional rights, and he routinely received savage criticism from a variety of directions. One newspaper editor compared him to the Roman Emperor Nero, or Nehru, and seemed to call for his assassination. This man praised the, quote, Roman patriot who exclaimed, "Why was not this monster killed when he took the first step of that despotism, which had been allowed to go on until he has shed the blood of the best sons of Rome," end of quote. In terms of constitutionally mandated executive power, Lincoln issued proclamations. His position as commander-in-chief during wartime expanded this aspect of his authority. For example, neither he nor Congress had any constitutional power to end slavery in a state or locality loyal to the Union. He based the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 on, quote, the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy and Army of the United States in times of actual armed rebellion, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, end of quote. Apart from proclamation, Lincoln had substantial constitutional authority in 2 key areas. Number 1, he shaped a national strategic power policy that demanded re-establishment of the Union and later emancipation as non-negotiable elements to any resolution of the war. This is where the slogan, Union and Freedom, originated. And 2, he made 2 types of vital personnel decisions. selecting and removing cabinet officers and deciding which generals would serve at the highest level of command. His decisions in naming generals and the way in which he worked with them proved to be decisive in winning a war that as late as the summer of 1864 seemed destined to end in Confederate independence. Lincoln's selection of Ulysses S. Grant to be General-in-Chief in March of 1864 and the two men's resulting relationship eventually provided the foundation for victory.
All right, let's move now to our second part of our presentation, and that is a look at Lincoln's style as Commander-in-Chief. He brought very little education, military experience, national political service, or administrative background to his new job. In fact, he provides a cautionary example for anyone who fetishizes credentialing. Anyone looking at the resumes of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis in 1860-61 would have concluded without question that Jefferson Davis had far more potential to be a successful commander-in-chief. Davis had attended Kentucky's Transylvania University before he went on to graduate from the United States Military Academy. He successfully led a regiment of Mississippi Volunteer Infantry during the war with Mexico. He commanded more men in combat before the Civil War than anyone who commanded an army on either side during the war, except Winfield Scott. He was twice elected a senator from Mississippi and was an innovative Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He's the one who brought camels to the Southwest as animals that might do better than mules or horses. What a thought. He also chaired the Senate's Military Affairs Committee. He checked just about every box you could check. Lincoln, in contrast, had a meager 6 months of formal education, had logged a few weeks of militia duty as a company grade officer during the Black Hawk War of the 1830s, and served a single term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois in the 1840s. He could boast of no administrative experience beyond running a small legal office in Springfield, Illinois. As a leader, Lincoln proved willing to put aside his ego. He had an ego, he had a substantial ego, but he often put it aside. He could overlook slights, he could tolerate prima donnas if they delivered results. He maintained an unwavering focus on the overriding national goal of crushing the Confederate rebellion and restoring the Union. However unpopular individual decisions to achieve that goal might be among various parts of the national voting populace. Members of his own party tried to dump him from the ticket in 1864, and as we shall see, some of his top generals openly opposed him. Let me look briefly at some of the important elements of his style of leadership, and I'll start with the fact that he surrounded himself with able advisors. Somebody is walking out of here with Doris Kearns Goodwin's book tonight. I forget who it is. There we go. And someone else has copies to give away. Someone over here did. A lot of Doris's books floating around. He surrounded himself with able people, and he chose for his initial cabinet 3 individuals who had national reputations and who in fact had vied for the party's nomination in 1860. William Henry Seward, and he's the buckaroo on the right up here, was the most famous Republican politician in the country. He became Secretary of State. Salmon P. Chase, on the left up there, your left, headed the Department of the Treasury. And the third one, who doesn't get as much attention as the others and didn't merit a picture here tonight, was Edward Bates from Missouri, who accepted appointment as Attorney General. Seward and Chase early on definitely believed that they would have been better people to occupy the White House than Abraham Lincoln. Seward came to admire Lincoln a great deal. Chase not so much. And he maneuvered to win the Republican nomination in 1864. Yet Lincoln utilized Chase's undeniable talents as the head of Treasury to help move the Union war effort along, and then after being re-elected president in November, very deftly solved any problems that might go forward by making Chase Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after Roger Brooke Taney died. Lincoln more than held his own among these powerful figures. Doris Kearns' team of rivals, as we've heard already tonight. He benefited from their counsel and talents, but he went his own way when he thought it necessary. An anecdote about his style of leadership, it's apocryphal but nonetheless revelatory, recounted a cabinet vote that went 7-1 against the president, at the end of which Lincoln announced 7 nays, 1 aye. The ayes have it.
The second element is that Lincoln exhibited tremendous capacity for growth, a willingness to learn from those better versed on some topic. Early in the war, for example, like most Americans, he believed one big battle would settle the issue. He urged his generals to force a showdown in Northern Virginia, rejecting the argument that volunteer soldiers were green and needed more training. At a cabinet meeting on June 29, 1861, he commented to General-in-Chief Winfield Scott about the two forces facing each other in Washington. Quote, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are green alike." The more numerous green soldiers on the U.S. side, Lincoln reasoned, would defeat their less numerous rebel opponents. After a humiliating defeat at First Bull Run the following month, Lincoln acknowledged that he had been wrong and General Scott correct. Only training and experience, both of which took time, would convert the volunteers into soldiers. The war would take much longer and require far more men and material than Lincoln initially imagined. Lincoln also manifested a willingness to give great latitude to generals who might deliver results, even if they exhibited problematical traits or proved personally antagonistic to him. Here he kept his eye on the final overreaching goal, victory and a restored Union. Complaining, snubs, and posturing, all of which he endured in full measure in dealing with his generals, never persuaded Lincoln to think first about himself or engage in efforts to get back at the offenders. Jefferson Davis, in contrast, pursued long-running feuds with some of his generals, most notably the prickly Joseph E. Johnston. As he matured as commander-in-chief, Lincoln settled on 4 requirements for military victory. First, efficient logistics would undergird successful military campaigning. He devoted considerable attention to the unglamorous tasks necessary to clothe, to feed, to arm large numbers of soldiers. Second, control of the Mississippi River, as well as other major waterways, would support Union initiatives and undercut the rebel war effort. Winfield Scott's influence is very apparent here. Third, U.S. commanders should target Confederate armies rather than cities. If the major rebel armies were defeated, the places they defended would thus fall into Union hands. Finally, and perhaps most important, the United States must apply its far greater industrial power and its 2.5 to 1 edge in manpower in the most sustained, relentless manner to win the war before the civilian morale collapsed. It should do so, he believed, even at the risk of high casualties that might prove problematical in the short term, but would shorten the war and save lives in the end.
All right, we'll move to the third part of our presentation now, and that is Lincoln and his relationship with the 4 generals that we've mentioned. His relationship with these generals centered on his search for a leader who would utilize the nation's, as Joan said, superior manpower and resources effectively. His greatest disappointments, from beginning to end, arose when commanders failed to do so. Everybody knew the United States had more men. Everybody knew the United States had far more in a material sense than the Confederacy, which made it especially vexing when Confederates would achieve successes. We're going to look in chronological turn at the 4 officers we mentioned, each of whom Lincoln trusted to achieve the nation's military goals. And we're going to look at how his relationships with each of them illuminates an element of his leadership. The crucial problem in finding capable commanders, capable candidates to lead armies, arose from the fact that pre-war experience for United States soldiers had not in any way prepared them for the size of the conflict they would find themselves engaged in. The U.S. Army in 1861, as you all know, it numbered about 15,000 men, scattered all over the landscape in small garrisons and along the coast for the most part. Lincoln knew this. He knew there wasn't a deep bench, so to speak, of possible Army commanders. There wasn't a room somewhere that had a sign on the door that said, "Able Army commanders inside, please knock." There's nothing like that. His dealings with Winfield Scott, the Army senior officer, showcase his efforts to educate himself about military affairs. Scott was nearly 75 years old at the start of the war. A splendid age, I've decided. He'll be 75 in 2 weeks. Scott first gained combat experience in the War of 1812. During the war with Mexico in the mid-1840s, his strategic and operational planning and execution proved daring and innovative. Such was Scott's skill in Mexico that the Duke of Wellington, who possessed one of the most towering egos of any military figure of the 19th century, pronounced Scott, quote, "the greatest soldier of the age." Although little known to modern Americans, I believe Scott ranks among the 5 best generals in United States history. After his initial failure to follow Scott's advice, Lincoln wisely sought to learn as much as possible from his venerable general-in-chief. Scott drew on vast experience and a first-rate intellect to propose a strategy that the press called the Anaconda Plan. And here's how one of the newspapers at the time presented this plan. There's the anaconda snake surrounding the Confederacy. It was called the Anaconda Plan because people said it sought to squeeze the life out of the Confederacy. You all know this. Scott envisioned a naval blockade to deny war-related imports to the Confederacy. He also envisioned a combined Army-Navy strike down the Mississippi River to split the rebel republic into 2 pieces. And should the Confederacy continue to resist after those 2 things were in place, Scott said the United States might be required, in his words, quote, "to conquer the seceding states by invading armies." These proposed operations, cautioned the aging general, would take several months to organize, might stretch across 2 or 3 years, and might involve as many as 300,000 men. He's saying these things at a time when most people envisioned a one-battle war with relatively few soldiers over quickly and so forth. Scott, when he devised this, brought his experience in Mexico to bear. This is what the United States had done against the Republic of Mexico. They had blockaded the Gulf Coast of Mexico to keep it from bringing things in, had sheared off the northern provinces of Mexico in the early stage of the war, and then in the end had projected power into the hinterlands and then the heartland in Scott's famous campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City. Scott was well aware of the political and popular pressures on Lincoln to strike an immediate blow to end the rebellion, but he eventually proved successful in convincing the president that precipitate action held scant promise. Lincoln accepted that it took time to train raw troops and collect supplies. Somebody isn't a soldier just because he has a uniform on, said Scott. A soldier is somebody who's had training and actually might have learned something, not just how he is dressed. Lincoln accepted this. Military realities sunk in with Lincoln that eluded many newspaper editors and a quite high percentage of the members of Congress. Although he retired on November 1st, 1861, Scott had sketched a strategic blueprint that Lincoln embraced and which proved prescient in times of what actually took place during the war. Winfield Scott, in March and April 1861, essentially sketched out how the war would be waged over the next 4 years. And we turn now to George Brinton McClellan, who is not there and neither there nor there. There it is! Look at George B. McClellan there, striking a Napoleonic pose with his right hand, and you can tell what he's thinking. It's his first thought every morning when he woke up. What about me? Do people realize how wonderful I am? He's thinking. If they don't, I'll do my best to convince them. He provides an example of how much aggravation Lincoln would tolerate from a subordinate that he believed might achieve military success. A subordinate who did not respect the civilian superiors ran the war. in our system of government, and who often pursued his own plans to prosecute the war even when they deviated from those of Abraham Lincoln and other civilian superiors. For example, McClellan never accepted the transition to a harder kind of war in the late summer of 1862, a war that targeted the institution of slavery as a way to defeat the Confederates. He always hoped to restore the Union as it had been before the war, restore the Union on the antebellum model. He was only 34 years old in 1861. 34 years old, he's in charge of all the armies of the United States. I can promise you right now that will never happen again. I used to think about this when my own son was 34. I loved my son dearly. I thought, Will in charge of all the armies of the United States? I don't think so. He graduated second in his class of 1846 at West Point and served as a member of Scott's staff in Mexico. If you were on Scott's staff in Mexico, that is a very good thing to have on your resume. He resigned his commission in the mid-1850s to pursue a lucrative career as a railroad executive. He also succeeded at that. During the Civil War, he demonstrated superb organizational but deeply flawed operational leadership. Undoubtedly charismatic, he forged an unmatched bond with his soldiers. No other commander on the U.S. side built the kind of bond that McClellan had with the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. In the wake of Union disaster at First Bull Run, McClellan converted a dispirited rabble of 35,000 into a competent and well-trained force of more than 100,000 that he christened the Army of the Potomac, by far the largest army to that point in United States history. He also instilled in the subordinate armed officer corps a culture of caution that lingered long past his own departure from command. Every organization has a culture. Everyone in this room knows that. That culture is often put in place by people at the top. McClellan absolutely did that with the Army of the Potomac. Within that culture, he counseled avoidance of risk. He obsessed about logistics and sought never to undertake a movement until everything was perfect. Everybody, again, in this room knows everything is never perfect in life. If you're waiting till everything is perfect, you'll never do anything. He avoided delivering a true knockout blow to the enemy, aiming instead to defeat the rebels just enough to persuade them to come back into the Union. And he always manifested an awareness of possible political repercussions from his military activities. He opposed many of Lincoln's policies, as I've already said. In the end, McClellan created a powerful military instrument, but proved hesitant to risk it in battle. In mid-19th century parlance, he lacked the moral courage to take chances in pursuit of decisive results. Lincoln entrusted McClellan with 2 jobs from the autumn of 1861 through the spring of 1862. General-in-Chief of the United States Armies and Field Commander of the Army of the Potomac. He warned McClellan that the dual positions of General-in-Chief and Commander of the Army of the Potomac might be taxing, and McClellan replied, and I will quote him directly, "I can do it all." Lincoln wanted 2 things from McClellan. First, keep his civilian superiors informed about strategic and operational plans, and second, carry out an aggressive campaign against rebel forces in Virginia. Well, McClellan refused to keep Lincoln informed about what he was planning to do, and he let many months elapse without moving anywhere in the Eastern Theater, all the while demanding more men and material and grotesquely inflating Confederate numbers to justify his inaction. The 1860 census had already been published at the time this was going on. Everybody knew that there were 4 times as many white men of military age in the United States as there were white men of military age in the Confederacy. And the notion the Confederacy could put larger armies in the field was simply not a reasonable thing to argue that that is what McClellan was doing. "I'm leaving nothing undone to increase our force," he wrote to his wife in the early autumn of 1861, "but the old general, Scott, always comes in the way." Scott finally had a belly full of McClellan's behavior, and he simply, "I'm 75, I've had enough, I'm going to West Point and I'm going to write my memoirs." He left in November of '61. As for Lincoln, McClellan described the president, quote, "as nothing more than a well-meaning baboon." McClellan's contempt for Lincoln reached a low point on November 13, 1861, when the President and Secretary of State paid a visit to the general's home. They went to him. They didn't ask him to come to them. McClellan wasn't home when they got there, and they were ushered into a little parlor. McClellan later came home, went upstairs without speaking to Lincoln, and after about 20 minutes told his butler that he could tell the President, the Commander-in-Chief, that he would be happy to see him some other time, but was retiring for the evening. Lincoln didn't pitch a fit. He and Seward left. He never went to McClellan's house again, needless to say. McClellan often paraded his anti-administration politics and encouraged subordinate officers to do as well. He wrote an influential Democratic friend about his opposition to making emancipation a possible war end. "Help me to dodge the Negro," he wrote. He didn't say Negro. "I am fighting to preserve the integrity of the Union." Failing to capture Richmond during the 7 Days Campaign in June and July 1862, he nonetheless gave what came to be called the Harrison's Landing letter to Abraham Lincoln, which lectured the President about what policies he should follow regarding emancipation. In the end, Lincoln never could get McClellan to act aggressively. In March 1862, he removed his bulky subordinate as General-in-Chief, but left him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. When McClellan unnecessarily retreated from Richmond in July 1862, and then just 2 months later allowed Robert E. Lee to escape unharmed, after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln lost patience. A note to Lincoln dated October 25, 1862 conveyed his utter frustration with the general's lethargic actions. Lee's army had recrossed the Potomac in one night after the Battle of Antietam, but McClellan remained immobile near the battlefield for more than 5 weeks after fighting ended. He claimed he couldn't pursue Lee at one point because the Union Army's horses, quote, "are broken down from fatigue and want of flesh." "Will you pardon me for asking," responded Lincoln with a mixture of sarcasm and anger. Many of you already know this quotation, but here's the punchline. "What the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam, it fatigues anything." If McClellan had won victories and pressed Lee, that boy right there, Lincoln probably would have put up with his insubordination, his open political opposition, and his personal snobbery. But the President would not do so with a man who did not win. The day after the autumn elections in 1862, he sacked McClellan. He timed that action to avoid Democratic backlash at the polls. Lincoln is always attuned to politics, of course. McClellan never led an army in the field again. But in 1864, he ran as the Democratic candidate for president against Abraham Lincoln.
A blessedly brief consideration of Joseph Hooker will further illustrate Lincoln's patience and frustration with problematical officers. I love his hair. It's all me. Hooker took charge of the Army of the Potomac in January 1863. Nicknamed Fighting Joe, his appointment seemed to bode well for future aggressive operations. Lincoln initially looked the other way about troubling behaviors. Hooker talked publicly about how the nation needed a dictator to win the war, implying that he would be a good one. The President reacted in a remarkably perceptive and blunt letter on January 6, 1863, quote, "I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier," began Lincoln. "You have confidence in yourself, which is valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." Hooker also bragged about what he was going to do to Lee, observing that he hoped God would have mercy on Lee because he, Joe Hooker, would not. Lincoln correctly feared that such boasting before the general had accomplished anything revealed insecurity. He used one of his barnyard examples to make the point, quote, "The hen is the wisest of all the animal creation because she never cackles until the egg is laid." What would we do without these Lincoln? Just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, which took place between May 1st and 4th in 1863, Lincoln pressed Hooker to utilize his superior manpower, 130,000 to Lee's 64,000. Hooker knew the numbers because he possessed excellent intelligence about the strength of Lee's army, but a failure of will and nerve at Chancellorsville brought humiliating Union defeat. Lincoln spent several critical days at the telegraph office carefully following the action. A witness recounted how the president, upon realizing that Hooker had retreated, turned ashen and exclaimed, my God, what will the country say?" In June, when Lee marched north toward Pennsylvania, Hooker proposed to take the Army of the Potomac southward to capture Richmond instead of confronting the rebel army. Lincoln had had enough and fired Hooker. He simply could not bear a general who seemed unable or unwilling to deliver a knockout blow against the Army of Northern Virginia. Oh, finally. Grant at Cold Harbor. We'll close with Ulysses S. Grant, who apart from Lincoln did more than anyone else to defeat the Confederacy. He and Lincoln provide an example of how our constitutional system ideally functions during a military crisis, uniting a determined president with a talented soldier who understands and accepts civilian oversight to work toward a common national goal. 39 years old when the war erupted, Grant had logged both staff and line duty during the 1840s. He left the Army in the 1850s, desperate to rejoin his family after difficult postings to the West Coast. We can all agree with that. Financial failure dogged him and his family for much of the 1850s, a period of adversity that toughened him. He came to prominence in the Western theater of the war, the vast expanse defined by the Appalachian Mountains on the east and the Mississippi River on the west. Victories in 1862 and 1863 at Forts Henry and Donelson, at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, and Chattanooga brought Grant appointment as General-in-Chief in March of 1864. He received promotion to the rank of Lieutenant General, what we would today call a 3-star general. This was extremely significant because only George Washington had held that rank. Congress reinstated it just for Grant. Grant's subsequent behavior validated the most important personnel decision of Lincoln's presidency. In contrast to McClellan, Grant dutifully carried out all administration policies and came to agree with most of them. Always aggressive, he rewarded subordinates who pushed their men to achieve decisive results. During his year with the Army of the Potomac in 1864-65 as General-in-Chief, he accompanied but did not officially command the Army. While with the Army of the Potomac, he labored incessantly to root out the culture of caution McClellan had created. In perhaps the most startling departure from McClellan, Grant made do with available resources rather than constantly asking for more. Grant's tribute to Zachary Taylor as a general might well be applied to himself. Quote, "General Taylor was not an officer to trouble the administration much with his demands, but was inclined to do the best he could with the means given him. No soldier could face either danger or responsibility more calmly than he. These are qualities more rarely found than genius or physical courage." End of quote. Now, Grant possessed those rare qualities in abundance. He was willing to take responsibility for all of his actions and almost singular in his habit of making do with what the government gave him. He mirrored Lincoln's determination, his ability to focus on a goal, and perhaps most important, his refusal to be derailed by initial failure. Never making excuses for his setbacks or laying blame on subordinates or civilian superiors, he simply went back to the drawing board. Examples of this attribute can be found in his Vicksburg campaign, the Overland campaign against Lee in 1864, and elsewhere. No one saw the large strategic picture more clearly than Grant. As General-in-Chief in the spring of 1864, he planned a series of offensives that would strike at both the Confederacy's army and its capacity to produce and distribute materials needed to sustain the war. An old quartermaster, he knew the importance of logistics and targeted the economic, the agricultural, the transportation underpinnings of the Confederacy through what scholars have labeled a strategy of exhaustion. Destroy the enemy's ability to clothe, to feed, and to arm its soldiers, he reasoned, and you don't need to kill these soldiers in large and bloody battles. But he also understood the political pressures on Lincoln and adapted when necessary. For example, at the time of his elevation to General-in-Chief, he knew that the Northern public thirsted for a direct confrontation between him, the Union's best soldier, and Robert E. Lee. He knew as well that Lincoln had wanted someone in charge of Virginia who could smash the rebels. He thus incorporated a direct challenge to Lee and his army into his broader strategy of exhaustion. During the resulting Overland campaign of May to June 1864, he applied ceaseless pressure that brought combat on a scale unknown, even in this bloody war. Constant attrition yielded in 6 weeks more than 65,000 U.S. casualties in an army that began the campaign with 120,000 men. Try to imagine how Americans of today would respond to news that our military forces have lost close to 750,000 casualties since the second week of October. Later in the war, Grant embraced Lincoln's vision for an easy peace when he offered generous terms to the rebels who surrendered at Appomattox. Grant likely agreed with Lincoln's views in this respect, but the point to remember is that he did what his civilian superior wanted him to do.
In short, this was a model civilian-military partnership between Lincoln and Grant. Lincoln gave Grant wide latitude, and Grant calmed Lincoln down on occasion. Just before Vicksburg fell to U.S. forces in July 1863, Lincoln stated, quote, "Grant is my man and I am his for the rest of the war." That was the case, and the leadership of these two men, more than any other factor, enabled the United States to emerge triumphant from the crucible of a mammoth war. The next time any of you find yourselves in Washington, D.C., on the Mall, take a moment at each end of that long green swath. In front of the Capitol sits the imposing equestrian statue of Grant, dedicated in 1922 and bearing a single word, Grant. At the other end of the mall, the Lincoln Memorial, also dedicated in 1922, faces eastward toward the Capitol from near the Potomac River. It's entirely appropriate that Abraham Lincoln and U.S. Grant face each other from opposite ends of the mall in the capital of the nation. Their leadership did so much to save. Questions, comments, arguments? Yes?
It seems like many of these generals, excluding Grant, believe that they could capture cities and win the war. The wars are only fought by killing the opposition army. And instead of killing the army, I just read a book by Nigel Hamilton, Davis versus Lincoln. And many of these generals were out to capture cities, not to be a way to a victory. And I always believe the only way to win a war is to kill the opposition. Grant did it.
The comment is the way to win a war is to kill the opposition, not capture cities. And that's what Grant did. Lincoln believed in targeting armies, as we mentioned, not cities as well. But Grant didn't just target and try to kill the enemy. Do you want to talk about Grant's numbers? How do you want to do that? I mean, his idea in 1864 was a much more indirect way. He was drawn into the Oberlin campaign because he understood, he was very adept politically, he understood Lincoln was under pressure to go after Lee.
That's why he set in motion a number of endeavors during that time, but the key thing that he wanted to do is stay in Virginia and let other armies do the work. And for example, Sherman's army and the march through Georgia.
Grant has this reputation as being a bloody butcher. That's one of the labels that was fastened on him. The former Confederates were very good at that. He's not nearly as bloody a general as Robert E. Lee. Bloodiest general in United States history in terms if you're going to award that palm by who gets the highest percentage of his soldiers shot, Robert E. Lee wins, period. Period. Joe Glattauer wrote a very good book on the Army of Northern Virginia that did the most sophisticated sampling anyone's ever done about any army, and he calculated that if you're a soldier in Lee's army, you had a 73% chance of becoming a casualty. 73%. 73%. If the Confederacy ever got you in uniform, you never got out, because they kept changing the rules according to conscription. So you're in for the duration. The U.S. honored terms of enlistment and let soldiers out. The Confederacy didn't. Lee's casualties, before he and Grant ran into each other during the Oberlin campaign, 95,000. Grant's casualties before he ran into Lee, 35,000 in all those great victories out in the West. Grant became a bloody general at the same point every other Union general did in the East when he ran into Robert E. Lee. Yes?
Would you name your 4 other greatest generals in the United States?
Yes, I'll name my greatest generals in U.S. history, and anybody can disagree. You'll be confused, but you can go ahead and disagree. George Washington, U.S. Grant, Winfield Scott, George C. Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower. Those are my 5 best. And then,
What about William Sherman?
he's very good.
Very good, is that a B plus?
B plus A minus. That's right. And Robert E. Lee is in the discussion because he's never a United States general. We're talking about United States generals.
What about Patton?
What about Patton? Can you imagine Eisenhower waking up every morning and thinking, gosh, it looks like a good day. Oh, that's right. Patton and Montgomery are under my command. He was very good at some things. He was a lot like Stonewall Jackson. He had reached his level of competency, however, Patton had, I think, just as Jackson did as a Corps commander. Jackson would have made a horrible Army commander because he would have been a wretched administrator. Too rigid, just awful with
A
personality.
great general, but a thorn in the side.
Big thorn,
Yeah.
yes, a mighty big thorn he was. Yes.
I have 2 questions. First of all, Joan, could you say again, you said the characteristic that was most important because genius and courage are large compared to the quality you said that Grant had. And the second question is, why wasn't it that Lincoln didn't pick Grant? There must have been some politics behind it to be the general earlier.
Well, I think Grant was in a very different position at the beginning of the war than was somebody like George McClellan. Being in the Western theater meant everything to Grant's career because he couldn't get, he pretended not to get the telegraphs from the Eastern theater. So that was, he had I think, a native ability to be aggressive and smart at the same time. And he just wrapped up the victories, even though, I mean, with Fort Donelson made him a national hero, and then Shiloh, bloody Shiloh, was controversial, but it still notched a win on the Union side. And Lincoln had his eye on Grant. He had reports from his guys in the field about Grant. He was worried about his drinking because those were the rumors. But I guess what you can say is Grant, as I guess Lincoln said, Grant fights. And that was the big difference.
What, was Halleck standing in the way?
Halleck and Grant had a little bit of a problematical relationship, but Halleck, when Grant loved it when he was sent to Washington, D.C., so he couldn't receive the telegraphs or the reports as early. But I think they got along pretty well. It was after the war where Grant, he was a little bit harsh on Halleck in his memoirs.
Could you answer the first question too?
I grabbed that quote, the two qualities that you mentioned. He said, no soldier could face either danger or responsibility more calmly than Taylor. Grant talking about Taylor. That, he says, more rarely found than genius or physical. That faced danger or responsibility more calmly. We talked about Sherman. That is what Sherman couldn't do. That's why Sherman was an abject failure early in the war. When he had ultimate responsibility in Kentucky, he collapsed mentally. He imagined Confederates coming from every direction. He was sent back from the front. A Cincinnati paper said Sherman is insane. He admitted that he would have committed suicide if it hadn't been for the shame that would have brought on his family. Then he's put under Grant. And with Grant assuming overall command, that freed Sherman to be successful. That's what I meant. You can reach a certain level. Sherman's a great soldier, but he can't be the man. Grant can absorb the responsibility and all the slings and arrows that come with responsibility for difficult decisions.
It's very different experience to read Grant's memoirs and Sherman's memoirs, one after another. And you realize that there's a reason that Grant's memoirs are generally considered to be a masterpiece, a literary masterpiece, as well as an account of the Civil War. Sherman's are boring. You learn a lot from them, and you know that he had a personality that was forceful and controversial, and he was brilliant and intelligent, and he might have been smarter than Grant in the IQ, but he could, as Gary said, he couldn't take the responsibility.
And it's amazing that his book is sort of boring because he's never boring.
He's never boring.
He doesn't have a filter between his brain and his mouth or his pen. And he had
He has no sense of humor.
He had self-awareness, which we don't have our boy McClellan up here. McClellan, in the dictionary where it says lack of self-awareness, there should be a picture of George B. McClellan. There it is, lack of self-awareness. Sherman had perfect self-awareness, and he made a comment directly on this point we're talking about. This is just a close paraphrase. He said, I know more about strategy than Grant. I know more about tactics than Grant. I know more about everything than Grant. But where he beats me and where he beats the world is he don't give a damn what the enemy is doing out of his sight. And it scares me like hell. That's an amazingly blunt assessment of Sherman's greatest weakness and Grant's greatest strength. So all the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac coming to Grant when they first ran into Lee in the Battle of the Wilderness, what if Lee does this? What if Lee does that? What if Lee does this? And Grant said, why don't we let Lee worry about what we're going to do? This is what John Wooden used to say.
Well, Lincoln, the thing is, Lincoln really, he never met Grant until Grant came to Washington and in 1864, and they immediately hit it off. All Lincoln had were these telegraphs and reports from various spies that he sent to report on Grant, and they never had a word of disagreement.
And they're both Westerners.
And they're both Westerners.
Both Westerners.
He appreciated that.
Yes.
Well, a little bit on that point, you said the first time that Lincoln met Grant was when they were in conversations with how to take command, but with McClellan and Hooker and others, right now, if there was a major post in even a corporation, you'd have multiple rounds of interviews, you'd have 7 loops, you'd have a board of directors.
That's so 21st century.
I know. But if Lincoln had a chance to actually sit and spend quality time with some of these early commanders, do you think that they would have made it? Do you think, was he a quick judge of character and would he have been able to pivot?
You mean if he had an early interview with Grant or?
With Hooker and McClellan.
Oh.
Both of them seem to be, from what you're describing, egomaniacal, narcissists, and seemed like Lincoln was a pretty good judge.
Like so many people we know today.
Lincoln had, early on, Lincoln had a little bit of the problem that Lyndon Johnson had with the people he called the Harvards during the Vietnam War. He went to Southwest Texas State Teachers College, and here are all these guys from Harvard and Yale, McGeorge Bundy and all the rest, they're so smart, McClellan is sort of that way. I mean, the Easterners were that way. They spoke, Lincoln never tried to change his way of speaking. He had a backwoods bumpkin accent, and he never tried to change it, and that put off people like McClellan and Charles Sumner and Solomon P. Chase, who made them think they were smarter than Lincoln because he would have said skier or key.
Charles Sumner was put off by almost everybody.
Almost everybody.
Almost everybody.
His "what about me" mornings were just like McClellan's. They were. Yes, middle of the room.
Here we go. Question for both if you don't mind. Was there a turning point in the Civil War and what was it?
I'll tell you what it wasn't, and then Joan can tell you what it was. It was not in Adams County, Pennsylvania. Okay, good. Period. Wonderful. Great. You
I
don't
think
really
the
believe
turning
it, but
point
that's
of the
true.
Civil War was Vicksburg. The fall of Vicksburg, the defeat of the army.
We disagree on this. We say,
You go ahead.
no, you go ahead. Vicksburg was certainly more important than Gettysburg.
In
No
fact,
question.
I have written about that, and I have a talk. Vicksburg is the turning point of the Civil War, and I think that a good argument can be made that for any turning point, that would be it. But there are so many who can, that might be applicable.
If I had to pick one battle that had the greatest influence on, that just shaped the contours of the war more than any other, I would say it's the 7 days in Richmond, because the war's almost over. In June of 1862, the war's gone to hell in the West, where Grant's been doing his thing. The Confederates are on their heels everywhere, and the largest army of the Republic is within 5 miles of the Confederate capital with an O, not an A. And McClellan should have captured Richmond. If he had, the war would have been over. It would have been over in July 1862. It would have been over with slavery still in place. But because of the 7 days, the 7 days did two critical things. On the Confederate side, they brought Lee to the fore and put him in command of the Army of Northern Virginia, which changed everything from then on. And McClellan's failure persuaded both Congress, which passed the Second Confiscation Act about 2 weeks after the end of the 7 days, and Lincoln, who a week after that announced he was going to put emancipation on the table to his cabinet. So slavery is going to be a key part, and that changes the war entirely. Everything's on the table now for the Confederacy, their entire social structure, everything. So the 7 days, far more important than Gettysburg in terms of its impact on the way. Vicksburg is certainly more important than Gettysburg.
I also think one of the interesting aspects from my long-time study of the Civil War, and especially of Grant, is how important it was in the Western theater, particularly in Mississippi and Tennessee, the issue of the freed, enslaved people who were brought into Union camps, and how to transition them from slavery to freedom. The military was in charge of this at first, and I know Grant in the Western theater was responsible for setting up contraband camps, for finding people like the women of the North who would come and serve as nurses to treat the terrible diseases. I mean, it's a fascinating story. Isn't the Civil War amazing? There's just no end to it.
And Atlanta is really important because Atlanta re-elected Lincoln, so the one thing we agree on is that Gettysburg isn't the turning point. Even though a number of states have a question that all their high school students have, what's the turning point of the Civil War? And the answer is Gettysburg on all of those tests.
It was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain saved Western
He
civilization.
did.
Maybe one or two more questions. Yes, I know there are more of you than want that. We have a drive back all the way across, practically to the coast tonight. Yes. Oh, listen to the empathy from this guy. Oh.
Does anyone have a plane?
Yes, your question.
One of the things about Grant, which, from the beginning, like Belmont, is that he learned by what happened. It was not like he understood everything, this is the way it is. He changed his opinions. And Belmont was like one of his first battles. And, originally they knocked out the Confederates left. And his soldiers are rampaging through the camp. Then the Confederates come back and they have to leave. And he learned so much about what was happening and how the soldiers believed and what he believed in. And that's what I think makes him such a, an incredible general, that he understood and he grew by everybody's experiences.
That's a great point, and it's something that has really struck me. And I've written about it, the fact that he was considered a failure, an abject failure when he came into the Army. This was a chance for him and to put what he knew were his skills to good use. And he did it out of, as I made the point before, out of the publicity of the Eastern Theater. He was allowed to create his own battle plans and put them into put them to successful conclusions. And so by the time that Fort Donelson fell, it was a huge, he just became, from that point on, one of the big hopes for the Union Army and for the Union cause.
And at Belmont, one thing about Belmont that impressed Lincoln is that he was aggressive at Belmont. He wasn't reactive, he was aggressive, and that's what Lincoln was trying to get out of people at that point. All the way in the back.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question. I've heard that in its most reductive sense, that the Civil War is a war between the North and the South over the West. And I just wondered if both of your opinions, if you would agree with that.
That is a very fashionable way to approach the war now, because people are tired of dealing with the actual war. And so there's another war that's even more important than the actual war. Is the West important? Of course it is. Extension of slavery into the West is really the element of slavery that most divides white people, and most white people don't give a good goddamn about black people in the mid-19th century. We wish it wasn't true. It's true. They do care about who's going to go into the West. So the West is, of course, important there. But the war is about whether the government founded by the generation of brilliant statesmen in the late 18th century could survive an internal crisis. It's not, so yes, the West is in there. It's lurking somewhere out here where we are now. California, right, not really at the center of the Civil War.
But on the other hand, the West was on Lincoln's mind during this time, or else how can we explain the 3 laws passed in 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act? I mean, it's just, I mean, that legislative flurry.
And the Homestead Act.
And the Homestead Act and the Morale Education Act. And I mean, that was for the future.
Yes.
Those were war-related
But
measures.
none of that would have mattered
No.
if the United States had not defeated the Confederacy.
Right.
You don't have, I mean, they talk about, well, it's way too late to go down that route. But we could do that another night, talk about
Another night.
Another night.